Chelsea. We are going to be talking a little bit about a lot of things today, but I'm going to give everybody a um, chance to hop on. I'm going to share this on a couple of different pages. Let me see. Oh, there we go. They've changed the Facebook Live in the last month since I've been using it, so it looks a little bit different from my side of things right now. Okay, so like I said, I'm just trying to share this on a different page, but maybe it's not going to let me do that. Either way, we're going to let people hop on before we get started. Everybody join us. There we go. Hello to my 4 people. It's just like lecturing to undergrads. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we are going to be talking about Theodore Roosevelt and his book, African Game Trails. So this book was published in 1910, so we're going to be doing kind of a deep dive into this book. We're going to talk a little bit about why it was created, right? Like how it came to exist. We're going to talk a little bit about how it actually came to exist. So like how did Theodore Roosevelt like come to go on an African safari? How did he come to write this book? But then we're going to talk a little bit about how it came to exist, like in a broad historical context. Like how is this book possible? How is Theodore Roosevelt possible? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then I do want to connect it to the Binghamton region just a little bit too, because there are actually some interesting connections between Theodore Roosevelt and Binghamton. Obviously, he was New York's governor for about a year before he became vice president. He was part of the New York elite, so he is very much connected. Ooh, sorry, the book gave me a little bit of scratchiness in my nose. But obviously Theodore Roosevelt was connected to New York in a lot of ways, but I'm going to talk a little bit about his linkages in Binghamton itself. So let me just grab one more thing, making sure everything's going good. Okay, great. So if you guys joined in last time, I talked a little bit about the book, Siberia and the Exile System, which was written by George Kennan. You can actually see it. You can see it right there, that big green book. We talked about that last time, so it's been about a month. But I thought it would be interesting to start us off with a bridge of connection between Theodore Roosevelt and George Kennan, because when I've done archival research on George Kennan in the Library of Congress, there's actually letters between him and Theodore Roosevelt, which is pretty much to be expected. They were both men of a certain status at this time period in American history. But most importantly, Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize for helping to secure the Treaty at Portsmouth, which basically ended the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And I think that's where they got a lot of connection, because George Kennan had actually traveled to Japan and reported on the Russo-Japanese War during the war. And so they would have been kind of discussing political matters. They would have been discussing, these types of things. And so they both actually were on the side of Japan, notably. Like George Kennan actually helped create propaganda in amongst Russian POWs in Japan to try to get them to kind of overthrow the Tsar. And TR really believed that Japan was the more mighty and more kind of effective Asiatic power. So he was actually rooting for Japan to win the Russo-Japanese War. But anyways, so that's our kind of point of connection. They were both contemporaries. They were both pretty interested in that particular topic. But of course, Theodore Roosevelt is a figure who maybe doesn't need a whole bunch of introduction to us as Americans. He's on Mount Rushmore. He's one of probably the most well-known presidents that we've ever had, and he was a big personality, right? He was a pretty big personality, pretty big kind of guy. And so he became president, obviously, in 1901. And he set off on his African game trail kind of journey right at the end of his second term of the presidency. And it's actually interesting, and maybe this is already common knowledge, but I do want to set up kind of the state of mind that Theodore Roosevelt would have been in when he went to plan this particular trip. He goes to Africa. Well, we'll get there. But so in 1901, right, he became president, not because he was elected president, but because William McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz in Buffalo in 1901. And so Theodore Roosevelt became like the youngest president that we've ever had when he was basically became president following McKinley's death. And so in 1904, when he ran for president for his second term, but it would have been his first campaign to run for president, he actually promised that he would never run for a third term, even though he could legitimately run for that third term because he'd only been elected once in the post of president. But he promised and made this promise and said, I will not run for president again. And he came to really regret that throughout his second term because he really enjoyed being president. He, by all accounts, was a pretty effective president. He didn't necessarily charm everyone. Not everybody liked him. This is a time period where, William McKinley, his running mate, was a pretty staid Republican man. He, Mark Hanna, who was a really big and influential guy at that moment in history, he basically helped fund McKinley's campaign. And so he was more of a kind of old, I guess, more stodgy type of Republican, whereas TR was kind of becoming a progressive activist. And so he brought in trust busting, and he brought in a lot of really heavy-handed government oversight that previous Republicans had not really been into. Really, neither party really wanted much of an activist government in the 1880s and 1890s. But anyway, so it's important to understand that we remember him in a lot of ways very positively and very favorably, but because he rocked so many boats, he was not always people's favorite president during this time period. But so he had this kind of problem in 1908 because he had promised people that he wouldn't run for president again. And so he handpicked William Howard Taft to be his successor. And Taft had actually worked really closely with Roosevelt. He had worked with him throughout his presidency. Taft actually was the most popular surrogate in 1904 during that presidential campaign, which meant that he went and he gave speeches for Roosevelt. And Roosevelt really trusted him. They were really, really close. And so Roosevelt felt like he was passing the torch onto somebody that he could really trust to kind of carry on his progressive legacy and to continue, busting trusts, to continue doing all of these different things. And so in 1908, Taft runs for president and Theodore Roosevelt endorses him. Well, again, Roosevelt's kind of depressed about this. And so at the end of his kind of lame duck term in early 1909, Roosevelt starts cooking up the idea of going to Africa. So he thinks it's going to solve a couple of problems or offer him a couple of opportunities. So one, he's not going to be in the United States for Taft's first term because he doesn't want to interfere with his presidency. He kind of wants Taft to be his own man. Two, he's always wanted to go to Africa and hunt game. Theodore Roosevelt was definitely a man who really enjoyed hunting. He enjoyed the kind of chase. He was also a conservationist. He was a lot of things. So we're going to kind of get into the ways that those things combined during his Africa trip. But Roosevelt kind of understood that he was kind of a divisive figure and that it would probably be good for him to step back as well. Like he recognized that the United States maybe needed a little bit of a steadier ship for a little while. And he knew that Taft would be very capable. And Taft indeed was a quite capable man, but he was never somebody who enjoyed being a part of kind of the executive branch. And so one thing that I hope I can leave us with today is the fact that, yes, Taft was a larger man. He struggled with his weight. Theodore Roosevelt also struggled with his weight. He had tennis courts installed, partially to help keep him thinner. But I know that people laugh and say like, oh, Taft got stuck in a bathtub. He was really fat. But y'all, Taft was the only man in history to be both president and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So let's just like give Taft his due and like stop talking about the bathtub. So that's my like one little soapbox to get on today. But anyway, so this is the context of the trip starting to become a reality, basically, for Theodore Roosevelt. And so he had always, like I said, dreamed of going on an African hunting trip. And this ties directly into what we know about Roosevelt himself. He really believed in the strenuous life. And this is something maybe that you've heard before. It's it's something that we talk a lot about because he talked a lot about it. And basically, Theodore Roosevelt is really interesting because he came of age in a moment in time where Americans really were starting to revere the self-made man. This has become kind of a trope in the 20th and the 21st centuries, but in the 19th century, it was really a very common thing that you would see in literature, that you would see kind of in politics. So people, for example, really admired Abraham Lincoln because he had started from very modest background and had become the president. And that was something to emulate. You also had men like J.P. Morgan, who had worked his way all the way up from like kind of a lowly worker to like the controller of this like vast monopoly to become like one of the richest, if not the richest men in the world at the time. But Theodore Roosevelt had a problem, which is he was born into the elite. He couldn't be a self-made man in that way. So the way that he kind of fashioned himself into that narrative is that he really talked about this kind of strenuous life because Theodore Roosevelt was a very sickly kid because he had really bad asthma. And this is before you had inhalers. Those really didn't come into use until the 1950s. So if you had bad asthma, you couldn't breathe. And he would have panic attacks. So he wasn't able to go to public school. He had to be privately tutored at home. And so this was something that had always made him feel very weak. And he actually had a day where his father sat him down and said, if you want to be successful, you have to be strong. You have to kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Work out your body, become stronger. That's the only way that you're going to find success. And so what Theodore Roosevelt did in his early teens is he started working out. He started really pushing his body. And we know that asthma, typically childhood asthma, becomes less severe in your teenage years. And so that's probably part of what happened. But Theodore Roosevelt really believed that he had kind of changed his attitude, he had changed his life, and that had changed his body and had made him kind of more strong and more virile and just like a better man. And so you see him throughout the rest of his life basically searching for these type of kind of masculine endeavors that he can kind of join in on to help prove his manliness to himself, to prove his strength, right? To just prove his fitness, right? And so, for example, probably most famously, he gets involved in the Spanish-American War and creates the Rough Rider Division and loves being called Colonel. People call him Colonel Roosevelt more often than they call him President Roosevelt. He just liked being called the Colonel. And so he really believed in the benefit of warfare. And so you see this in his like real warmongering for the Spanish American War. He unequivocally supported that war, even though it was a little bit, well, it was very contentious in the United States. He also, it's really interesting, he really valued football, which was kind of a new sport at this time. And it got pretty close to being banned because there was one year where like 12 or it was somewhere between 10 and 20 men at like Harvard, Yale, kind of the big college football leagues, they died. And so there was a lot of discussion amongst like the head of Harvard, the president of Harvard, saying maybe we should just end football because it's very dangerous. But Theodore Roosevelt actually brought all these football guys to the White House to kind of figure out a solution because he believed that football was the closest thing that a young man could get to warfare. And it was something that would prepare him for war. And so it's all building into this kind of idea of the strenuous life, is that he really believes that in order for you to develop well and for the country to develop well, you need to be strong. And this is also coming at a time much like our own, where the United States was entering a new modern age. So you had modern conveniences for the first time, right? Like this house had gas lighting, it had heat, it had all of these things. You're getting these modern conveniences and you're getting a middle class for really one of the first times, or at least like an office level, like kind of administrative, bureaucratic middle class. And there's a lot of anxiety about like what's going to happen to the country if all of our men are just these effete dudes who sit at a desk all day and don't get muddy and don't get dirty and like kind of don't really like realize their masculine potential. And so Theodore Roosevelt was definitely a part of that as well. He really prescribed the United States these kind of masculine endeavors in order to thrive in a new kind of modern age. And so all of this is at play when he is planning this trip. So he actually writes to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. He writes to the head of that museum in late 1908 and basically says, I want to go out and get African specimens that you don't have, and I want to bring them back to help conserve this kind of scientific evidence, scientific data, things like that. And so the conceit of this is both he wants to go out and be in the rugged wild and kind of fight for himself and shoot things and carry guns. And he wants to do that. He finds a lot of enjoyment out of that. But he also has this kind of conservation aspect of it, where it's supposed to be an explicitly scientific endeavor. It's supposed to help preserve these animals. You have to understand too that in the early 20th century, the buffalo had just gone extinct, like out in the Midwest, or the bison. Oh, if I said that wrong, just ignore it. But you had that it was a very real problem. And so Theodore Roosevelt, like a lot of his contemporaries, understood that nature and civilization were going to butt heads in the 20th century, and that nature was going to lose to civilization. And so he made a lot of efforts during his presidency to start conservationism, to set aside national parks. And so this trip was supposed to be a part of this. And, you know, people didn't necessarily agree that the way to contribute to conservation efforts was to kill animals. That is still a hotly debated topic today about whether or not game hunting is actually something that contributes to conservation efforts or damages it. I'm not necessarily an expert in that, but it is the same debate that we continue to have. And Theodore Roosevelt definitely fell on the side of, well, if we kill them, we can then study them, we can preserve them, we can put them in museums, and then after they go extinct, we'll have like that kind of specimen still in the museum. And this is also to kind of add more to the historical context of like how we get this book, how he ends up going to Africa, is the fact that Darwin's theory of evolution had obviously hit in the mid 19th century and was continuing to have a really big impact on these type of scientific expeditions. And so people wanted to go around the world, people meaning largely white Western men, but not exclusively, but they're some of the most prominent ones. And so they feel like that because of Darwin, we now understand evolution. We now understand that maybe God didn't create these things, but that they developed over time. And so there's this new desire to study it and try to understand how evolution works, understand how one creature becomes this massive, super strong fighter, and how one creature becomes like a little tiny chipmunk or something like that. It's all part of this moment where people really believe that we can catalog and understand and control the natural world. So that's a really important kind of scientific context. And it's really important to talk about too, because science has a history. That's one of my favorite kind of subgenres of history, or disciplines of history, is the history of science, medicine, and technology, because all of those things have changed over time, and it's really interesting to study them. So this is, again, part of that new world, this kind of belief that 1900 meant that we were now the most advanced, the most modern, the most progressive society that had come to pass, and that we were going to change the world, right? And that we were just at the cusp of modernity. We were searching and kind of striving towards civilizational progress. These are all things that TR really, really believed in. And, it's one of these things that also bled into the eugenics movement of the time period, which I just wanted to briefly mention, because this idea of the survival of the fittest really started moving into not only a discussion of how, monkeys in Africa developed, or fish in the Pacific Ocean developed, but how the human race developed. And so there was a new push in this period around the time that Theodore Roosevelt was crafting, the plans for his adventure, to try to make the human race more effective and more efficient. And so in like 1907, we have our first mandatory sterilization law that was passed in the United States, where you wanted to have these kind of, the more fit people breed and the less fit people be sterilized or not be able to have children. And Theodore Roosevelt was very much in favor of that. And he also really believed in a race suicide. So he believed that whites were kind of the most advanced race, and that they were not giving birth to enough white babies, and that the mongrel, quote unquote, mongrel races were actually kind of developing and breeding or having children at a much higher rate. So he thought that white civilization was actually in danger. And so this kind of context is really important, because it kind of helps us understand some parts of the book that otherwise you would kind of wonder why he's talking about these things at all. But so I think it's important to understand this context of he is going to Africa at a time when people were, at a time when Africa had been newly colonized. So he ends up going to modern day Kenya, the modern day Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Sudan. And at that time, they had all been recently colonized. So Kenya and Sudan had recently been taken over by the British. And then Congo, very infamously, was the private property of King Leopold II, and then had recently changed hands to be controlled by Belgium. And so you actually have, I wanted to read a small excerpt from the book here, where he's talking about it just at the very beginning. And he says, the places where he's going, this was called kind of East Africa at this time. And he says the places where they're going included not only Englishmen, but also Germans and Italians, which is quite as it should be, for at least part of the high inland region of British East Africa can be made one kind of white man's country. And to achieve this, white man should work heartily together, doing scrupulous justice to the natives, but remembering that progress and development in this particular kind of new land depend exclusively upon the masterful leadership of the whites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he actually goes on to say, like, we should take heart that the Africans who I see in Africa are really underdeveloped. That's how he would have understood it. But African Americans were reaching the status of kind of white civilization. And so he was saying, like, this is the good influence of whites on Africans, right? So this is an essential background to recognize and understand that definitely influences the fact that he goes to Africa, that he can talk in this way about Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that when we talk actually about his trip. But again, the purpose of this whole adventure was to set out for scientific conservation. And so he actually gets funding from the Smithsonian. He then signs a book contract. I think this is with, I thought it was with Doubleday, but it's not. He signs it's Charles Scribner's. So he signs a book contract with Charles Scribner's. And so the money he gets from the book contract actually pays for him and his son Kermit to go with him to Africa. So his cost and all of the supplies and stuff necessary, and Kermit's costs and supplies are paid for by this book. So that's really why the book comes to exist, because he promises to write one. Because Charles Scribner and Sons knows it's going to make a lot of money. So we've got the Smithsonian kicking in money, we've got his book contract kicking in money, and then because he's not super confident that the Smithsonian will give him all the money he wants, he goes to third-party private financiers too. So I actually read that, was it Carnegie? Where is it? I can't remember if it was Carnegie or Rockefeller. One of them also, I think, pitched in some of the money to this as well. So it's paid for by a lot of people. And so they get everything figured out. They set up the trip, and he actually sets sail just 19 days after Taft is inaugurated on March 4th, 1909. So that's how we get to the trip itself. He sets off, and he promises not to talk about politics, because I want you to understand one important thing is that, yes, Theodore Roosevelt goes to Africa and goes into some maybe less inhabited places, but he is in the newspapers constantly. So if he wanted to go to Africa and then talk a bunch about how Taft was becoming a bad president, he could have done that. But what he promises to do is to basically not talk about politics for his entire trip and just try to remain silent. So the trip ends up lasting 11 months. And then after that, he spends about 2 months traveling around Europe before he ends up coming home. So he leaves in March 1909. He gets back in June 1910. So that's about 13 months that he's actually out there. So like I said, where he actually ends up going is modern day Kenya, the modern day Democratic Republic of the Congo, and modern day Sudan. So that's a pretty wide swath of space. I was actually hoping to be able to share half of my screen today so I could show you some more of the images, but Facebook Live doesn't want to cooperate with me for that. So I do have some images from the book that I'm hopefully going to be able to show you. But the map, for example, that he has in this book doesn't really show you a great amount, because it doesn't show you the full entire continent of Africa, so it's kind of hard to tell. But he basically, like I said, spends a lot of his time in East Africa. He actually, I wanted to make sure I mentioned, he brings 3 naturalists with him, so 3 men who are going to help him collect specimens, kill them, put them in formaldehyde or salt them or prepare them in some way, shape, or form. So he travels with one guy he's an ornithologist. His name is Edgar Alexander Mearns. He travels with another man named Edward Heller, and then he travels with a guy who is an expert in small mammals, and his name is John Alden Loring. And so he is actually from Owego. Loring was born in Owego and died in Owego. He actually is buried at the Evergreen Cemetery, which is just up the road from us in Owego. So he actually gave a speech in late 1910 about his adventures with Theodore Roosevelt. So he's maybe a man for another time, but I thought that's really pretty cool that Theodore Roosevelt ended up traveling with somebody who's basically from our own backyard. So I don't know if there's anybody out there who knows a bunch about John Alden Loring, but maybe we could do some research a little bit later. So what does he actually do, right, when he's here? He is he obviously goes out and hunts a lot, right? So, but let's imagine what this looks like. So he's got his son Kermit. He's got these three kind of scientists with him. And then he also has an entire entourage of people. So he's not going out into the wilderness just by himself. He's going out with over 100 native porters. So these are Africans from various regions of the continent, and they are carrying his stuff and Kermit's stuff and everybody else's. So they're carrying like probably thousands of pounds of supplies. So you need food, you need ammunition, you need boxes to store these specimens in. You need all of this different type of stuff. And so I was reading, like, they're carrying like 25 pounds of jam, and they're carrying all of these books, and they're carrying like everything that you could need. So it's a huge outfit, right? Which is necessary if you want to do scientific work, because you have to somehow be able to take these animals, kind of preserve them, and kind of ship them back. And over the course of this 11-month expedition, TR and his son alone kill 512 large animals. And the entire kind of entourage kills a little bit over 11,000 things. So it's plants, it's mammals, it's bugs, it's fish, it's all of these different things. So it's a lot of things that they're cataloging, they're bringing back. And you have to understand that the Smithsonian was really interested in this trip because they had direct competition between the Field Museum in Chicago and the National Museum of American, I can't remember. It's the one that's over in New York. It's a museum of natural history. I think it's the National Museum of Natural History or something like that. Or the American Museum of Natural History, that's what it is. So it's over in New York. So he's got this place there's this place in New York, a museum in New York, there's a museum in Chicago, and then you've got the Smithsonian that's still kind of starting off. And so they don't have very many specimens from Africa at all. And this is the way that you used to fill your museums. It's the way that people used to conduct scientific research. You would wonder, how does that animal operate? We'll kill it and open it up, or kill it and we'll examine it, and then we'll taxidermy it, and we'll put it in our collections. This is not something obviously anybody does anymore. Science has changed a lot. Not only has our kind of idea about whether or not it's permissible to kill in order to study for science has changed, but just the actual technology we have is very different as well. But I thought it was interesting because I found that he actually had a priority of things that he wanted to bring back with him. The number one priority was a lion. And what you see on the front cover is actually him, presumably that's TR, shooting a lion. So the number one thing he wanted was a lion, and then it was an elephant, a black rhinoceros, a buffalo, giraffe, a hippo, and then the list went on. But those were in order, kind of his top 6 or 7 animals that he wanted to kill and bring back, right? And I say kill because there's this real tension between whether or not what he was doing was hunting or whether or not he was doing conservation work. Like there's this tension throughout this entire period. And so you have a lot of descriptions in the book. Some of them he says, like, we're doing this for science. So for example, in the tally, let me find the tally. He actually includes a tally of game shot by him and his son Kermit. So again, it's 512 large animals. So that included 29 zebras, 11 monkeys of various kinds, 4 flamingos, 4 pythons, 4 crocodiles, and the list goes on. Another thing that he was really proud of is that he shot 2 total family groups of white rhinos because they were already going extinct. And so he sent one family group to the Smithsonian, and he sent the other one to the American Museum of Natural History over there in New York City. And today there are only 3 alive in captivity. And so the idea was that he wanted to collect these specimens before they died off. And again, maybe today we definitely use different preservation and conservation techniques, but that was one of the things that he thought was proper and that he wanted to do. But so it's really interesting because at the end of this little tally of all the things that he and his son shot, which is kind of like, why do you need a tally, right? Why do you need a tally? But he says here on the following page, he says, Kermit and I kept about a dozen trophies for ourselves. Otherwise, we shot nothing that was not used either as a museum specimen or for meat, usually for both purposes. We were in hunting grounds practically as good as any that have ever existed, but we did not kill a tenth nor a hundredth part of what we might have killed had we been willing. The mere size of the bag indicates little as to a man's prowess as a hunter and almost nothing as to the interest or value of his achievement. So basically what he's saying here is that, yeah, we shot all of these things, but we only kept a dozen trophies for ourselves, and the rest we either ate or we sent to a museum. And basically he says, like, the size of your bag, the size of like your kill doesn't equate to your ability to be a good hunter. Like, you don't need to indiscriminately kill. And basically says the amount that you kill doesn't equate to your achievement either. Like, those are not necessarily related. And so it's interesting because today I know there's still a lot of uncomfortable and kind of uncomfortable feelings about this, right? And there's a lot of pictures of kind of dead animals throughout this book. And it's important to understand that this is a different time. And, you know, we can definitely say, we don't really want to do that anymore. Or, you know, and some people say that's good, right? This is, like I said, still a very hotly debated topic about whether or not TR killing like 2 families of these white rhinos that are now basically extinct in the wild. They are completely extinct in the wild, right? Was that a good thing? Was it a bad thing? You know, that's where kind of historical questions make us ask things of ourselves in the present day as much as they have us ask things about the kind of past in which these people operated. But so he really saw himself as a conservatist, as a conservator, whatever you would call him. He really saw himself as a scientist. He was really proud that there was this kind of legitimacy surrounding his trip because it was funded by the Smithsonian. But so you have this thing about saying, oh, we're not getting many trophies for ourselves, but you also have a lot of stories in the text. Like, this is quite a thick book. It's over 500, it's over 500 pages. Like, this is a pretty chunky book. And he talks a lot about the thrill of the hunt. So there's this tension throughout where it's supposed to be for preservation, but you can tell he really enjoys hunting animals and he really likes the skill that it takes to hunt those animals. And so so you get this kind of like, you get a very long detailed chapter about chasing an elephant, for example, and how dangerous it is and how like it's kind of thrilling and it's kind of masculine to take part in like a dangerous game. But then you also get sections where he says, oh, we killed a giraffe because naturalists really want a specimen of this giraffe because it's different from these other giraffes. And we're trying to figure out how they developed and how they evolved. And we're trying to basically learn this kind of essential basic information about these animals. But it's interesting because people at the time did criticize him. So throughout, like I said, throughout this period, I was just doing research on the Binghamton Press. So Binghamton's one of Binghamton's newspapers in this period, and I was just kind of reading through 1910 or 1909 to 1910, trying to follow him. And you see a story about Roosevelt almost every week, and it's always about him killing game, or it's like, oh no, Kermit got lost in the woods, but we found him. Or there was even a rumor in November 1909 that Theodore Roosevelt had died. And that was really, it was like a huge headline, you know, Theodore Roosevelt dies, blah, 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 blah. But so people were reading about what he was doing and not everybody was really happy about it. So you actually get a naturalist in 1909, and this is all stuff that was published in the Binghamton Press. It doesn't necessarily mean that Binghamton reporters wrote it. You know, it was probably through the AP or something. But you get a naturalist, his name was Dr. William J. Long, and he argued in May 1909 that all of TR's stories basically proved that he was more of a butcher than he was a conservationist. So I'll read a short quote here. He says, "As there are no reporters with Mr. Roosevelt, These reports of frequent killings must come chiefly from himself and are such as he himself chooses to send out. If they are true, they are exactly in line with his previous records. They prove that he is a game butcher, pure and simple, and that his interest in animals lies chiefly in the direction of blood, butchery, and brutality. So he doesn't have a fan in the naturalist William J. Long. Long goes on to say, basically, that not only is he showing his butchery, but he's also giving a bad example, setting a bad example for young boys. He says, Long basically argues that he's been going out into the woods and seeing boys kill like whole nests full of birds, or like killing baby bird moms, and like then the baby birds are dying of starvation. And he says, how could I convince these boys that their work was inhumane? For is it not the great American hero occupied at this time with the same detestable business? So basically these people are, this guy is arguing that TR is going out and killing all of these animals and setting a really, really bad example for American boys, which of course not everybody is going to agree with. This is just one dissenting opinion. So it's interesting too, because you get other people who are criticizing him during this period for talking about how wild everything was, about how, he's going into the depths of these kind of African nations or colonies, honestly, at this time. And so there's a British explorer who had made a name for himself for also going through Africa and exploring there. But he criticized basically the idea that TR was portraying himself as somebody kind of working and kind of living dangerously. And he says in like a newspaper article that a duchess had recently summered in a camp where TR had been staged, and she had summered there for her health. So the idea, of course, being like, oh, a duchess has just hung out there because she needed some like good sunshine, but TR wants us to believe that he's like, going through the wild and like is rough and ragged and all these things. And the truth, of course, lies in between those two perspectives, right? As we discussed, he wasn't alone, right? And he was in dangerous circumstances. So this is something that I want to really underscore, is that it's not that TR was in not doing dangerous things like this one critic suggested, but he was insulated in some ways from those dangers, whereas other people in his kind of party weren't necessarily. So I found a story in the Binghamton Press that talked about 3 native men who were traveling in his entourage. They had been mauled by a lion, and 2 of them had died. He also talks about in his book that a number of men were dying of fever or dysentery. So he talks about losing about 10 people in his party to either, like I said, fever or dysentery. There was a really bad case, I think it's called like the sleeping sickness, that was going around. I'm not sure what the common name for that is, but he talks about the sleeping sickness going around at that time, and like them trying to avoid it. So there were a lot of dangers, and people definitely got mauled by lions. People definitely got killed by hippos, which are mean. Elephants, if they're provoked, are also pretty mean. So they are dangerous wild animals that you're trying to kill and kind of harness. So it definitely was not just a walk in the park, but he also wasn't doing it single-handedly. He had like a whole team of people who would be helping him. So for example, here's a picture. I'm hoping that this will show up a little bit. Here's a picture of him with a big bull hippo, and you see how many people you need. I mean, if you think about it, like a hippo is real heavy, and an elephant is heavier probably. So you need like a whole entourage of people, that can help you out. So this story, of course, is really popular in the United States. Critics aside, like I said, you see something about Theodore Roosevelt and his Africa trip every week, really, at least in the Binghamton Press. I'm sure it's different in different newspapers, but you see people talking about it all the time. And they seem pretty delighted. Theodore Roosevelt was a guy that I think a lot of Americans really enjoyed. They liked his personality. They liked his kind of, his like candidness, right? They liked his ability to kind of use the bully pulpit as a force of his own power, which again, the bully pulpit isn't what we think it means. It means like terrific or good pulpit, like a good kind of, he saw the presidency as something that he could use to his advantage. And he did. He used those executive powers pretty liberally. But so what I want to talk about now is Theodore Roosevelt coming home. And unfortunately, I wanted, like I said, to share my screen, to share some of these things with you guys. But what I was going to do instead of that was just share a couple of links that I found while I was working on this project. So I just posted a link, which for some reason didn't hyperlink, but there we go. So I just posted a link to a book that was published kind of around the same time. It wasn't published by TR, it wasn't written by him, but it was kind of something that was published kind of in tandem. And one of the first images you see in this book is a shipment of the specimens of the kind of dead animals that were shipped back to New York from Roosevelt, from his African trip. And it's on page 7, I think. And it's just this really interesting picture because it's a warehouse. And you see box after box after box that just have a giant T and a giant R on it. So he sends it back and it's just like huge T, huge R, and it's a really interesting photograph. And the caption basically says, like, we could forgive a little hubris by, you know, the former president, because he wrote his name sometimes twice on these boxes. But like I said, he does bring back over 11,000 specimens. But before he does that, he actually takes a trip around Europe. And this helps us understand that Theodore Roosevelt at this time was probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous person in the world. While he was in Africa, he wasn't just like out in the safari or out in the jungle. He was actually visiting with British dignitaries and African dignitaries. He was doing a lot of kind of that kind of carousing and discussions. And he ostensibly, right, is not president, so he's not necessarily acting in the capacity of a head of state, but he's still really popular. And all these foreign dignitaries want to meet with him. And so his wife actually comes out to Europe after his trip is over in like March 1909, and they reunite, and he and Edith, his wife, they travel around Europe. So he goes to France, he goes to Germany, where he actually meets the Kaiser. There's an image of him watching kind of military preparations by the Germans in 1910, which is really kind of chilling, because, you know, the First World War starts just 4 years later. He also travels around to places like Belgium and France. I just learned that he had a really good relationship with the French ambassador, because the French ambassador would play tennis with him, or would do anything that TR wanted to do while he was president. So he had formed these kind of masculine bonds with the French ambassador. But during that time as well, King Edward VII actually died of Great Britain. And so he traveled to England as a favor to President Taft, who had asked him to do this. And he actually attended the funeral of this man in the capacity of like a representative of the United States. So he travels and he's super, super, super popular. And Taft himself actually says of TR in about this time period, he says, quote, "I don't suppose there has ever been such a reception as that being given Theodore in Europe. It illustrates how his personality has swept over the world." So Taft himself recognizes that TR is a very, very popular guy. But when he comes home, people are jazzed. People are really excited for him to come home. And so it's in a super, super elaborate welcome home celebration that is thrown in New York City. So not only do thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people come into the city like it's a holiday, but President Taft actually arranges for a bunch of military vessels to meet his ship that's coming back from Europe. So they give him like a 21-gun salute. They meet him, like I say, in the harbor. Descriptions of the time will talk about every every window on Broadway is decked out in bunting. There's a huge welcome committee established. Cornelius Vanderbilt is the head of this reception who helps kind of greet Theodore Roosevelt. There's actually a really good video of it, which again, I was not able to show you right now, but I'm going to copy it here. It starts at about 6:40, about 6 minutes and 40 seconds in. And so anyway, so he's brought back. People are really excited. He arrives on June 18th, 1910. They hold a 5-mile parade up and down Broadway, which brings in more than 1 million spectators. And what you see is you have a lot of people holding signs that say, please be president again, please run for office. You also have a display of a teddy bear fighting a lion, like a stuffed bear and a stuffed lion kind of fighting each other because he was, the teddy bear was named for him. And so it's just this like elaborate welcome home. And there's actually a full page or like a half page spread on the front page of the Binghamton Press that is welcoming him home. There's like really great photographs. Again, I wanted to show those with you. I'll figure out something better for next time. But there's a great little kind of op-ed in the the Binghamton Press newspaper, kind of anticipating his arrival, and it says, with all respect to President Taft, it may be said that the views of no man in public life today are as awaited so eagerly as those of Theodore Roosevelt. So basically what happens is Theodore Roosevelt ostensibly leaves to try to give Taft his own space, but comes back more popular than ever, and actually comes back and is finding out that Taft isn't really doing everything that he wanted Taft to do, and they actually have a very public break. And Theodore Roosevelt ultimately ends up running again for president in 1912, splits the Republican ticket between him and Taft. Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate's out there gaining 6 million votes as well, but ultimately Woodrow Wilson wins in the 1912 election. So you have this kind of punctuated Africa trip right in the middle, and then he comes back and decides to run for president. After he loses the presidency in 1912, he actually goes to the Amazon next, which is a terrible trip that really almost kills him, and he ends up dying in 1919. He's only about 60, a little bit over 60 at that point, but the Amazon trip really damaged his health. I would highly recommend The River of Doubt, which I believe Candace Miller wrote. It's an excellent book about Theodore Roosevelt. But so one of the things I wanted to kind of leave us with, because we're about at our hour mark, is the answer to the question, how did this book end up in the Monday Afternoon Club library, right? Why do we have it here amongst all of our other books? And maybe at this point, it seems pretty obvious. He was a popular guy. But I do want to note that the Monday Afternoon Club typically ran their programs from about, I think it's like September or October was their opening for the season, and then they would end in May. And Theodore Roosevelt actually came to Binghamton and Owego to speak in October 1910, which would have been, the book would have been out by then because it was published when he returned in 1910. So it's possible that maybe somebody in the Monday Afternoon Club was inspired by that to buy the book, or it's pretty likely that this was just a super popular book because he was a very popular guy. And so people probably purchased it because it was just one of the things that everybody was reading at this time period. So that's how I think it probably ended up being here. And it doesn't actually have our little Monday Afternoon Club mark in here. It actually has the mark of another person. So it's probably, it may have been the husband of a Monday Afternoon Club member, or it's possible it was even donated later. It says it's the owner was Frederick V. Branch of 74 Front Street, which I didn't know because I can't take this book home with me. I use digital versions. But so that it may be that it was donated later. But at any point, I think it stands to reason that a lot of people bought this book and really enjoyed it and read it with a lot of interest because Theodore Roosevelt was just such a personality, controversial personality in some cases, but nevertheless somebody that Americans all were talking about probably a lot of the time. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I really enjoyed learning a little bit more about TR. This is my time period, so you kind of learn a lot about TR just because he's so involved in a lot of different things. But it was really interesting to be able to read a little bit more about conservation efforts at that time period and talk a little bit about Africa. So I will note that there are a couple of books that I would recommend if you guys are interested in learning more about Theodore Roosevelt. So not only do you have Candace Miller's book, The River of Doubt, which is excellent. It's such a good book. You also have Doris Kearns Goodwin. She wrote a book about him and William Howard Taft and the rise of kind of new journalism. It's called The Bully Pulpit. That's a great book as well. It starts off with him getting back from his Africa trip. That won a Pulitzer, so there you go. And there's actually a new book about him as a scientist, or his interest in these conservation efforts, it's called The Naturalist, and it was written by a guy named Darren Lund, Lunde. So I think with that, I'm going to sign off for today. So again, thank you guys very much. I'm going to try to pick another book out here, maybe one with a little bit less colonialism, but we'll see. And maybe come up with another event, hopefully in June at some point. So I do want to mention that we're doing another event next Saturday. Joe is going to be talking about the Truman family, which actually owned this house in between the Phelps owning it and the Monday Afternoon Club owning it. So he's going to talk a little bit about them. So I hope you guys will tune in then. As always, if you enjoyed this or you found it really helpful or informative, I would love it if you would go to our phelpsmansion.org, our website, and donate a small amount if you can. If not, we enjoy having you every week, and we're looking forward to opening up sometime this summer, potentially, where we're going to definitely keep doing a lot of digital events because they're obviously going to be the safest option for a little while. If you guys have any books that you're interested in that you would want me to talk about, I guess you could send me that or message us some information. But other than that, this has been Chelsea Gibson, again, talking about books from the Monday Afternoon Club's library, from the Phelps Library. And this was Paging Through History. So I hope you guys enjoyed our conversation of Theodore Roosevelt, African Game Trails, and I hope you guys have a great day. It's beautiful and sunny in Binghamton, finally. So bye, guys.